that important discussion. But what I do want to say up front is I'm not a travelling snake oil salesman. I don't have any magic solutions. I don't have any silver bullets to offer that are going to address all problems associated with flooding. I think probably people here understand that better than people in most places. The flood issue is a complicated issue, and there really is no one simple solution that solves all of the problems. So if you walk away from here today thinking that I've told you about something that we can flip the switch tomorrow and not have any more floods, then I've failed, because that's not, I don't think, an accurate representation of the situation. So most of the, it's a bit information thick, this presentation, but I think you've been given a QR code where you can get a copy of the presentation to look at later, or follow along now up close if that's helpful. But most of the information that I'll show you is actually from New South Wales government documents, government reports. So most of it is not made up by me. It's been relaying what really are the accepted facts, and I'll show you a couple of points that I think are probably a little bit questionable or out of date. But other than that, most of what I'm going to tell you is really not contentious. So this is an image that comes from the 2021 flood review, showing the source of floodwaters in the Hawkesbury Valley. And an important point here is, if you look at the blue part of these pie charts, the size of the pie charts tells you how big the flood was, and then the blue part is what was the Warragamba source. So it's not the only source that leads to flooding. We have water coming down up in the Nepean, we have the Colo, the Gross, even the McDonald, all lead to flooding. Even South Creek lead to flooding in the Hawkesbury Nepean. But you can see that Warragamba often contributes between 40 and 60, even 70% of those flows, and in fact that's what we saw, I think, during the most recent flooding, when we had 500 gigalitres per day flow rates coming out of Warragamba into on top of Penrith, joining with maybe another 300 coming from the upper Nepean. So if we can do things at Warragamba, we can certainly have an impact, not completely remove floods. This is the flow gauge on the Warragamba River. So this is just downstream of the Warragamba Dam, and it shows you how much water is coming down out of the dam into the Nepean system from 2012 to 2022, the last decade. And if you look at this, I've just drawn in those lines, but they're roughly about where we would say 100 megalitres per day, 0.1 gigalitres per day is the normal environmental flow releases from the dam. If you get up to 10 gigalitres per day, then you're looking at minor releases, notable releases from the dam. But once you hit that 100 gigalitres per day, then we're talking about, you're really going to notice it down here. So that's a flood. And you can see that corresponds to the four most recent floods right on the end, are the points where we had more than 100 gigalitres per day being released from Warragamba Dam. So that's a pretty good indication. Even though there are other sources of water, that's a pretty good indication that there's going to be a lot of water flowing in this part of the world. And if you look back for the age of that gauge on the Warragamba River, it goes back to about 1980. You can see that, there are the four floods on the end that we just saw and just experienced. Big period during the Millennium Drought, there's nothing to talk about. In fact, the gauge looks like it stopped working for a few years there. But then right back down here in the 80s, you see it was much worse again. So really that risk is there to have a much more significant decade of floods than what we've currently experienced at this point. So this is an ongoing problem, obviously, that needs proper attention. This report, as you know, came out this week. This is the full report that was released by the expert committee. Professor Mary O'Kane and Mick Fuller chaired the committee that looked into the inquiry of the most recent floods. I won't read this out to you. Probably many of you have looked at it, but I think it's important to pick up the tone here. They're saying that raising the wall on the Warragamba Dam, that's a proposal that is in front of us. It has potential significant benefits, holding back some of those floodwaters that we're talking about, but they refer to it as a conundrum. It's not something that I think even these people who were asked to look at these most recent floods see as something that's really confidently there on the horizon. Whether or not it happens in the next decade, I think is highly questionable, and I would even have concerns about how realistic it is over the longer term. That's not me saying don't do it, that's me saying that I'm not confident that economically and socially that's a feasible solution, and therefore another reason why we should be not putting other solutions off the table at this point. So if you have a look at Lake Wyman in Brisbane, this is Brisbane's main drinking water supply. In Brisbane, they do keep the bottom half of the dam is their full supply level for their drinking water supply. It's about 1,000 gigalitres. And then there's another 1,000 gigalitres on top of that, which they keep empty. So you can see the red line here is 2011, the blue line is 2022 this year. And you can see those big floods that came into Wyman, filled up that flood mitigation storage, and then were released. They released it over about 7 days to get back down to the full supply level. So they can do it quite quickly. This system's a bit more constrained than that. You wouldn't want to release 1,000 gigalitres over 7 days unless you really, really had to. That would still cause severe impacts downstream. But the concept, I think, is a well understood concept, and it applies to many dams in New South Wales, as well as Brisbane's main drinking water supply. The key thing with this system, the Hawkesbury Community system, is not just the volumes. What really matters, in fact what we were just looking at, was the flow rates. It's how many gigalitres per day that really dictates what the impacts are going to be downstream. So this is a chart from the Hawkesbury and Valley Flood Mitigation Strategy Options Analysis that was published in 2019, table, sorry. And they're showing that if you have these flow rates down your right-hand side column, these are the impacts that you start to see at those flow rates. So below 50 gigalitres per day, there's not a lot of impact. It's quite fast-moving water, but it's not a lot of impact. Once you start to come up to around 80, 90 gigalitres per day, the Richmond Bridge is closed. This is older than the New Windsor Bridge. But once you get down here to around 200 gigalitres per day, you're really having some severe impacts to private property, the caravan parks, bridges, land, etc. So it's really all about understanding how fast you want that water to be travelling down the river and how much you can try and hold it back in order to delay some of those flows. What you actually see happening is you have water coming from the Upper Nepean through Malaysia, and then it joins with the water coming out of the Warragamba. And so when those peaks occur at the same time, that's when you have the really high flow rates further downstream. If you could hold one back, let one peak flow through first, so that starts to recede somewhat, and then allow the other one, the other peak, the other source, to peak a couple of days later, then you potentially have the opportunity to reduce the ultimate flood peak height, and you also have the opportunity to reduce, to delay when those flood peaks occur, so you give people more opportunity to be able to make use of the evacuation routes. There have been discussions about, can we look at a weather forecast and say, well, the weather forecast is that we've got a big storm, there's an east coast low hanging off the coast, likelihood we're going to have a big storm here. Could we quickly release some water from Warragamba Dam? The problem with that is you usually don't have more than about 3 days where you have some real confidence that it's going to happen here in this catchment. So again, this is calculations that have been produced, assuming you've got 3 days to release water, looking at if you released at 40 gigalitres per day, not much damage at 40 litres per day, or looking at if you release at 130 gigalitres per day, Richmond Bridge is closed but not too much property damage. Potentially you could create airspace of between 120 gigalitres to 390 gigalitres, which is actually not very much, and that's equivalent, you can see in the next column, to up to about 5.4 metres of height in the Warragamba Dam, and that's not a significant flood mitigation capacity. So what that actually means is that this isn't really a solution that's going to provide a lot of opportunity to capture floodwaters in Warragamba Dam given just 3 days notice. If you want to use Warragamba Dam as a flood mitigation dam, if you want some flood mitigation capacity, airspace retained in that dam, we have to think over the longer term. So it can't just be because there's a storm coming now. We have to be prepared for the fact that we don't know what the weather's going to be like, and there's a balance of probability about whether or not we might be going into a very wet area that might have a high probability of flooding, or we might be going into a dry period. That's the challenge. If you look at Warragamba Dam, so you have this sort of trapezoidal shape of the dam. So the proposal to build the wall up by 14 metres creates about 1,000 gigalitres of flood mitigation capacity, 1,000 gigalitres of airspace. Alternatively, if you were to drop the wall by 12 metres, you create about 795 gigalitres of airspace. So I've just put that in as percentages. 1,000 gigalitres is about 50% of the current Warragamba Dam capacity that you get by building the wall. Dropping by 12 metres, you get about 40% of the capacity. So it's not as much. You don't get quite as much flood mitigation capacity by dropping 12 metres as you do by raising the dam wall. The flip side of that is that it's potentially something that we could do much more quickly. Even if we did end up raising the Warragamba Dam wall, they're not mutually exclusive opportunities. This is something that could be considered in the meantime until that happens. So it's a big benefit to actually have 40%, 800 gigalitres of capacity. The reason we talk about that volume, the reason we talk about 12 metres as the magic number for which we might drop the volume, is because that's how the gates are arranged on Warragamba Dam. We don't release water out of the bottom of the dam. The water is released from the gates at the top of the dam wall, and the bottom of the gates is the 12 metre mark. So this is the full supply level up here, and then this is 12 metres below the full supply level is the bottom of where the radial gates open up. So that's a realistic opportunity to be able to use the currently engineered water system, water storage, to be able to release down to that level and provide that 800 gigalitres. But that's a lot. So if we look at the history of the last 20 years here of what the heights have been in Warragamba Dam, during the last 10 years they've been within that the full supply level down to about 5 metres, almost entirely, except for that very severe drought that we had that went for about 2.5, 3 years, 2017 to just into 2020. Other than that, the last decade, it has sat within that 5 metres of the full supply level. If you go back the decade before that, though, it was almost never within that 5 metres. We're in the millennium drought. And if you have a look at where we would draw full supply level minus 5 litres and full supply level minus 12, once you get down to that minus 12 metres, that's a concern for drinking water supply. We would call that a drought, and we would be flicking the desal plant on, making sure it was up to speed, operating at full capacity, and by about this time, in fact, about this 12 metre level, we'd be thinking about the next expansion to the Sydney Seawater Desalination Plant, which is a planned process to occur, but it's all about the timing, and this is about the timing we'd be flicking that switch. So if we were to do that, if we were to drop the full supply level, not have confidence that it was going to continue to rain and that we'd be able to maintain that level,